You remember the 1619 project stuff that's going on? The big debate
Right.
around some of that stuff?
hmm
So that's really crazy that that's flaring back up in the news. Donald Trump, what exactly did he threaten? Do you remember?
So the basically, it's been brought up that California is moving towards as a state using that into their curriculum. I don't know that that's. I'm in California and I have not, and I'm in education, right? Both me and my spouse are. I'm a professor. My wife's a high school teacher. Neither one of us have heard about this yet. Although we both teach math, so we wouldn't hear about this maybe as much. But I haven't heard about this. It's possible that you have certain areas which are trying to implement this into their system. But as of yet, I haven't heard it being a statewide thing. But Trump responded and said, well, if that's true, we're going to cut funding. Now, who knows? It could be like the 1619 project is a specific thing, right? And there's a lot to it, and it's gotten a lot of praise. I haven't had time to dig into it and see if every single thing inside there, if I agree with it or not. But it could be that there are parts of California that are looking to implement more of a history of slavery into the curriculum
Yeah,
and tell the history of the country from that perspective. And then someone just went with it and said, oh, well, they're going with the 1619 project. I don't think it's completely clear. Seems a little
hmm.
muddy to me. And then Trump has turned around and said, well, that's fine. If they're going to do that, we're going to look into defunding education here. Which let's remember, it's about what 10% of our education funding comes from Donald Trump. So he only has a limited amount of effect on that funding to begin with. Um, but that's the big controversy at the moment. He's threatening to take away funding for our schools if we start teaching the history of this country, including many facts which, let's face it, shaped our country.
Yeah, and this is a really big problem. So if you don't know exactly what the 1619 project is, it's basically an attempt to reorient and reshape, rethink about the way that we conceptualize American history, right? So typically we think about the beginning of American history relating to, 1776, the American Revolution. Maybe we'll start with the Boston Tea Party or some kind of early rowdies up of our revolution. Maybe, there'll be a little bit of sort of pre-stuff about Columbus, but it doesn't really focus in on slavery. So 1619 project is really an attempt to integrate that aspect of our history and explain and use that as an explanation for how we are and how we
Right.
got to where we are today. So it orients the beginning of American history at the year 1619, which is, of course, the year when the first African American slaves first came over to the Virginia colony to start picking what was tobacco, essentially, and also cotton later on. But I think at the beginning, mostly the Virginia colony was largely an economy which was based on tobacco early on, and that was sort of the first, sort of profitable crop that they were able to use. But in any case, when it comes to the 1619 project, there's a lot of people that are really critical. So, for instance, I made a video on my channel like about a month ago talking about how Tom Cotton was trying to pass a bill to cut back on the 1619 project and cut funding. So this is basically the reiteration of that. And what I said about it at the time was that it was really disgusting that Tom Cotton would try to do something like this because one of the arguments that he was using about it was that the 1619 project doesn't point out the fact. This was what Tom Cotton said. This is not what I'm saying, but this is what Tom Cotton said, that the 1619 project doesn't point out about how the founding of our country, while yes, it had slavery at the time, that in the founding of our country, it contained all of the prerequisites in order to end and abolish slavery in the long run. And he said that it was completely wrong to say that slavery was the fundamental sin of our country. I can't remember the exact phrasing, that it was the foundational sin of our country. And also, Tom Cotton had said, and this was the quote that especially blew up, is he said that there basically wouldn't be an America without slavery. And in a certain way, he was using that to criticize the 1619 project and say that it was nonsense, basically. But here's the thing. Technically it is true. There would not be America were it not for the case of slavery. So states like South Carolina, states like Georgia weren't going to sign on to the Constitution if it didn't include protections and provisions around slavery. Now, on the other hand, states like Massachusetts, who had by court order during the Revolution, actually, I think it might have been after the Revolution, but before the Peace of Paris, had struck down slavery. And states like Pennsylvania during the Revolution struck down slavery. They weren't going to get into a union which required them to be sort of pro-slave. And so the compromise essentially worked out to be that there was a verbal commitment that once the slave trade was ended, that it would be, or that the slave trade would essentially be abolished around 1808, 1809. I think that it officially was abolished in 1809. And that was a verbal commitment, whereas in the Constitution, it essentially protects the slave trade for about 20 years. And I think that expired around 1807, 1808. And it was Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, who came forward and proposed the amendment to abolish it because that was part of the verbal agreements to get it done. But of course, slave states, when it came time to actually, do their end of the bargain, pull their end of the bargain and vote against or vote for the abolition of the slave trade, they oftentimes weren't willing to do it, or at least it was much more controversial on their part than it should have been because they had made the promise 20 years prior. So anyway, the point being is that it is true that slavery is a foundational aspect of this country, and we've got to talk about it.
And there was a few things there, so let me see if I can get to all of them. But there's a couple. I mean, you talked about Tom Cotton's comments. That's hard to say. Tom Cotton's comments. Just looking at that, I mean, essentially what he's saying is the ends justify the means. Well, we wouldn't have all that we have today if we hadn't had that, which is, first of all, I think is a pretty rotten way to justify the abuses and the dark periods of our country's history by saying, well, look what it's brought us today. And even today, a lot of people look around and go, yeah, look what it's brought us. This isn't okay, and it's not working for a lot of people. So that kind of argument that, well, we wouldn't have this if we hadn't had slavery along the way, I think it might sound good at first to some people. When you stop and think about it, you go, that's actually a terrible take. And the fact that he's sort of justifying the very reason that you would want to teach things this way, because if you're saying that the way people were treated in the past, we had to do that to get to the point where we are, well, then all the more reason to talk about it and teach the history of our country from that perspective. If he's saying that's what got us to where we are today, great. That's what they're trying to teach, is that perspective that this was pivotal. And let's face it, whatever side of the aisle you're on, I think it's clear to see that you can teach the history of this country through a lens of racial discrimination, and you can see that,
and it's right.
Each time I remember being little and thinking, oh, they freed the slaves, good, everything was good then, right? And then you learn a little bit later, oh, well, no, in the 60s they took another go at trying to make people a little bit more equal, and then here we are 40 years later and we're doing it again, or whatever, 60 years later, a little less than that, and we're doing the same thing again because we still haven't reached that point of racial equality in this country. Yeah, of course, we need to expose those issues and talk about them so that the young people growing up don't fall into that same line of thinking and faulty logic that just says, well, it was bad, but it got us where we are, so let's just move on with it.
Right. There's a lot of difficult things when it comes to this. I was mentioning all the sort of history. What we also need to talk about, though, is the issue of how important it is, or, people in power oftentimes think how important it is for them to write the history. Whenever we analyze history, I remember being, a kid sort of learning about this, that the winners write the history. Well, this is an example of who's in power right now trying to shape the history that we're learning in schools. So it's not the case that these abstract things like winners write the history is, only for the history books and only for the historians. It's also an ongoing political debate, and it's an ongoing struggle, how we tell our own story, because that's going to influence how children growing up think about the world going forward. And look, we often talk about cancel culture, and we talk about how Republicans criticize Democrats for cancel culture. This is the epitome of cancel culture, trying to cancel the 1619 Project, trying to cancel, learning in schools, for our children. This is real cancel culture right here. Trying to censor the 1619 Project from schools, trying to make sure, trying to remove, by the way, Republicans always talk about states' rights to, choose their own educational curriculum. This particular story, talking about how California, an independent state, wants to choose an education curriculum, supposedly. I mean, there's disputes about the details about how this, what they mean by that. But California saying, we're going to teach a little bit more about slavery. We're going to teach a little bit more about this angle of history to our students. And then the federal government saying, nope, you can't do that. So whatever you think about this is hypocritical for sure. This is for sure hypocritical.